A new, fully FDM 3D printable RC chassis design for plastic model conversions is underway. A fun but at times challenging mixture of lifelike realism and functional RC components. But who doesn't want to drive their plastic model after they've put it together? Taking what I've learned from prior projects like these and applying it here to this all-new DIY platform, it's all about striking a nice balance of simplicity, aesthetics, and performance. From the initial design process to the first test drive, you'll see it all in today's video. Will this chassis prove to be the perfect base for not only your own project, but this 2005 Chevrolet Corvette that I'm building here? Well, let's have a closer look and find out. Hello everyone and welcome! In today's video, I'm excited to not only be showcasing an all-new car build, but also an all-new RC platform from yours truly. Converting these lifelike 1/24th and 1/25th scale plastic model kits into fully functional RC vehicles is nothing new, but there are many different ways to go about that process. There's no shortage of great-looking plastic model kits that do a fantastic job of replicating their full-size counterparts, this 2005 Corvette from Revell being no exception. Not only great-looking bodies, but oftentimes fully detailed engine bays, interiors, and chassis. With some projects like what you see here, I try to retain as many of these details as possible, making the functional RC components blend right in with the rest of the model kit. This results in a very accurate appearance, though it can be quite tedious to build and often requires quite a bit of design work, custom building, and dealing with some very tiny components, even by 1/24th scale standards. As much as I enjoy these types of projects, sometimes it's nice to simplify things a bit and build something a little more basic. Now on the other end of the spectrum, there are a plethora of great ready-to-run vehicles on the market, including many now in these smaller scales. A lot of these vehicles look and perform great right out of the box, though with some custom work you can add your own body, improve the scale realism, and really make it your own. While some assembly is required, platforms like our FPUC1 chassis are specifically designed for plastic model to RC conversions in 1/24th and 1/25th scale, my most recent project utilizing this chassis being that Audi R8. There are many design elements of that chassis that make it ideal for these types of builds, including parts that are easy to FDM print on any typical hobby 3D printer. Also, both the width and wheelbase can be adjusted to fit just about any body, and the chassis is pretty easy to put together, especially when compared to some of the more intricate components required for a more detailed build like this. While in general, I wouldn't necessarily recommend plastic model to RC conversions for someone with absolutely no prior RC or model building experience, as at least a basic understanding of how an RC vehicle works and some experience putting together smaller scale models are pretty vital prerequisites if you want to start combining these two hobbies. But that said, if you're new to this specific niche of RC, it really doesn't get much easier than this platform right here, and it's no wonder it's been by far our most popular platform, whether ordering as a physical kit from our website or 3D printing your own components available on our Patreon. Although that said, our more recently introduced CTC01 chassis, which is designed for larger commercial trucks rather than on-road cars, may be starting to eclipse the popularity of the FPUC1, as that platform has really been a hit for the semi-truck and commercial truck enthusiasts. Very happy to see others building some cool stuff on that platform, and of course extremely thankful for all the support. But we're keeping things a bit smaller and a bit sportier in today's video. Don't worry though, as much more tiny trucking content will be showing up on the channel in the future. But while the FPUC1 has been a successful platform for many projects, naturally like anything else, it does have some drawbacks. As I've built more and more vehicles utilizing this platform, and I've collected some feedback from our patrons and fellow RC model car builders, I think it's time to hit the drawing board and come up with a chassis design that builds upon what's been learned from these prior projects. Something that's a little bit more of a step up from the FPUC1, such as incorporating a functional suspension and better electronics placement, while also retaining elements that we like, such as being comprised of nothing more than standard off-the-shelf hardware and easy to 3D print parts that you can make at home. Oh yeah, and of course also being able to fit many different model car bodies that are 1/24th and 1/25th scale. Now at the end of the day, what I have here might not be perfect, but I think it's definitely something that has a lot of potential, and I look forward to ironing it out further with future iterations, as well as seeing what all of you builders out there think. I thoroughly enjoy the process of designing and engineering my own components, and it's not like this chassis is anything spectacular or going to be running down mini Z's on the racetrack, but still a lot of fun just making something yourself. The ready-to-run vehicles, kits, and well-established platforms from major manufacturers are awesome. I've got plenty of those that I drive around regularly, but there's just something about 3D printing all of your own parts, modifying a plastic model kit to fit, and building it up into whatever you want that's just so much fun. For me, it's a great sense of satisfaction, and I do enjoy the challenge along the way. Sure, there might be a little bit of a lack of refinement when compared to the store-bought stuff, but whether you're crazy like me and want to build this chassis that I have here, or you just want to listen to a guy rambling about building a custom RC Corvette for an hour or so, I know a lot of you guys like to watch these videos while you're working on your own projects. Either way, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and with the introductions out of the way, let's have a closer look at the chassis. As mentioned in that introduction, I intend for this chassis to be sort of an upgrade in some aspects over our FPUC1 design. It won't necessarily be an upgrade in every way, but for those looking for a platform with a functional suspension and a higher stance in particular, I think this is really going to be a great option. Scale realism is not so much the priority here. Simplicity, functionality, ease of 3D printing, and durability is going to be more of the focus. More function over form, I guess you could say, which is different from some other projects I've showcased here on the channel, such as that current 69 Revell build. More updates on that project coming soon, by the way. That, of course, has been a very fun project, but those parts are very much tailored to that specific model kit, where what I'm trying to make here is something far more universal and able to fit a wide variety of bodies. I'm not looking for every project to be quite as involved as what you've seen with that Revell, which is why it's always nice to have some standalone chassis options that you just 3D print, put together, and slap a body on top, doing your best to make it look as much like the real thing as possible, at least when looking at it from the top side. But as with any new design, I like to list out some goals and requirements that I have to try and accomplish, and this includes the following. First, I want this chassis to be as easy to 3D print as possible. I want all of these parts to be FDM 3D printable on a typical hobby grade machine, so I'll try to avoid overhangs, make sure parts have a nice flat surface for good bed adhesion, stuff like that to make them as easy to 3D print as possible. Of course, 3D printing is a bit of a hobby in and of itself, so make sure that your machine is producing high quality, dimensionally accurate parts before starting any project. This chassis utilizes our FCO1 front suspension and steering assembly. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from builders who like this super scaled double control arm assembly, but with its small size, a smaller size nozzle is definitely recommended, and you'll need to make sure that your 3D printer is well suited for making tiny parts like these. I also want this chassis to be assembled with basic, inexpensive, off-the-shelf hardware. Once you get all of the plastic parts 3D printed, there's no bespoke components required to get your chassis up and running. Basic, inexpensive hardware, O-rings, bearings, nothing complicated, nothing expensive. My next requirement was to have some form of functional suspension. The FPUC1 chassis has zero suspension, it's all just bolted to a solid base with any movement coming from the chassis simply flexing. Very simple, in fact really as simple as it gets, but obviously having some suspension movement when going over bumps or around corners is certainly nice and a highly requested feature. I'm still trying to keep things as simple as possible, but I definitely want to have some suspension movement. I also want this chassis to be easily adjustable both in wheelbase and width to fit as many different bodies as possible. Model car bodies come in all different shapes, sizes, and wheelbases just like the real cars they're replicating. Therefore, I want this chassis to be able to fit as many different bodies as possible. I also really wanted to enable the option to have more ground clearance than the FPUC1, being better suited for vehicles that have a higher stance. As you may be aware, the bottom of the FPUC1 generally sits only a few millimeters from the floor, especially if you have some smaller size wheels installed, there is very little ground clearance. Now this isn't at all an issue with some vehicles such as race cars or sports cars that are supposed to sit very low to the ground. However, for some cars like this Trans Am for example, which would have a comparatively higher ride height to something like this Audi R8, you can have that undesirable effect of the chassis being visible underneath the body, which is not a very good look. Now this chassis sitting very low to the ground does have the advantage of making it easier to fit an interior, but it would be nice to have the option to raise up the floor when building a car that's supposed to have more ground clearance to look correct. At the same time though, that very low clearance on the FPUC1 means that you need to be driving on very smooth surfaces to avoid scraping the bottom. It's not as though I'm making something that's going to be able to go off-road or anything like that, but a few extra millimeters of clearance would be nice. Another thing I really wanted to improve over the FPUC1 was relocating that steering servo and steering assembly for less intrusion into the interior area. Now that chassis positions the steering servo behind the front wheels towards the left side with the linkage sitting above the chassis. A very simple design, but I wanted to incorporate a smaller size steering servo, position it front and center, and have the linkage tucked out of the way, allowing more room for electronics in the center of the chassis, as well as potentially making it easier to install an interior. Another important design element is to maintain as low of a profile as possible to aid in adding interior and engine bay details. Basically, I want the chassis to be as thin as possible, if that makes sense, and not really stand that much higher than the tops of the tires. Maybe with the exception of that steering linkage, the FPUC1 does a pretty good job of this. Remember, I'm really designing this chassis for plastic model to RC conversions, so I want to try and make it as easy to install at least a shallow interior and engine bay as possible, since details like these are really what we as model builders like to add, blending scale aesthetics with RC functionality, with as minimal of a compromise to either aspect as possible. These are just some of the goals that I had for this chassis design, and with this in mind, I fired up Autodesk Fusion and began the design process. Really not a particularly arduous or time-consuming process, as I want the chassis design to be very simple. I began by loading in some pre-existing models of some of the non-3D printable components, including the steering servo and motor, and I worked the design around these components. Another time saver was utilizing our pre-existing FCO1 front suspension and steering assembly, rather than designing an all-new suspension. The FCO1 is comprised of some pretty tiny components, making 3D printing and assembly a little bit more of a challenge compared to some of the more conventional RC suspensions in the scale, but it's an assembly I've used many times before with a lot of success, and as long as you're capable of working with these tiny components, it goes together quite easily and it's relatively durable for what it is, more than sufficient for a highly detailed plastic model to RC conversion. The assembly process of the FCO1 will be no different whether you're installing it on this particular chassis or grafting it onto your own custom frame. The control arms mount to this piece here, which I've created a few different size variations of, allowing the suspension to be positioned either closer to or further away from the center of the chassis, hopefully allowing a wide variety of different width bodies to be used. While the front suspension is fully independent side to side, things are going to be more basic in the rear. Just a single threaded rod serves as a rear axle. Simply cut it to whatever length you need, mount the wheels, and you're good to go. Very similar to the FPUC1, however there are a few differences with this chassis. As you can see, I positioned the N20 motor and gear assembly behind the rear axle in an effort to leave as much room in the center of the chassis for electronics or an interior as possible, while also trying to keep a low profile. I also made the connection between the center portion of the chassis and this rear assembly relatively narrow and thin, providing enough flexibility to act like a suspension in combination with some springs that can be positioned above it. A very simple setup, and as you'll see later on, probably an area that could use a little bit more refinement, but a very simple solution to allow some suspension movement in the rear. Now, rather than having just a single chassis piece like the FPUC1, which all of your components get mounted to, you'll see in the center of this chassis, it consists of a lower piece and an upper piece, with the center of the chassis having a large cutout in the middle. The thought here was that by using some M2 hardware and something like O-rings as a spacer, the bottom floor of the chassis can be adjusted. So for example, let's say I'm building something like a race car or a sports car that sits very low to the ground. I now have the option to have the floor sitting lower down, which will position the electronics lower and possibly make adding details like an interior easier. Now if I'm building a car that should have a bit more ground clearance, like a vintage muscle car, I can also have that floor sitting higher up so it isn't visible, or at least not as visible when looking at the car from the side. I also figure this upper piece, which again the height can be adjusted, would be a nice spot to place some magnets to hold the body. Currently these pieces are pretty thin and quite flexible. Not exactly ideal, however, when using some M2 bolts and lock nuts, in combination with some flexible O-rings, tightening down these fasteners creates some tension, which helps keep the chassis somewhat rigid, at least as rigid as it needs to be in this context. This is something I haven't done on any prior chassis, so it's something I've been playing around with, still very much a work in progress. Now aside from those upper and lower pieces that I just talked about, this is currently just a one-piece chassis design that's very easy to 3D print, though I may consider separating this chassis into a few different pieces to enable further adjustability and suspension tuning. Being that performance and handling is really not top priority here, I just want this suspension to move. Where and how exactly it's flexing is not really a big concern for me. like it would be on a chassis that's designed specifically for racing. Although as you'll see later on, a bit more refinement in this area will likely be necessary. Obviously, if performance and refinement is your top priority, there are already a lot of platforms from major manufacturers available, such as the Kyosho Mini Z. These cars are available ready to run and are very quick and much more refined compared to this DIY setup that I'm working on here. There are also a lot of aftermarket hop-up parts if you really want to push the limits. It's not like I'm trying to make something here that's going to perform at that same level. If you want a Mini Z, just buy a Mini Z. That's not really the benchmark that I'm going for here. Instead, I'm just trying to create something for the DIY crowd who has access to a 3D printer, and that will be able to fit a wide variety of model car bodies. That said though, when built correctly, these cars are still a lot of fun to race around, and can be pretty affordable if you already have all the tools. And of course, like any RC car in this scale, you have the advantage of not requiring as much space to race them around. Just make sure that you have a nice, clean, flat area to do so. Now again, this is currently a one-piece chassis that doesn't allow for any adjustability when it comes to the wheelbase. I made the wheelbase here so that it will fit that C6 Corvette body that I plan on using perfectly. I do like the simplicity of this one-piece design, though obviously it doesn't really allow for any adjustability without modifying the design within CAD. At this point in time, especially with this chassis still being something I'm tinkering with, if you need a wheelbase other than this roughly 108mm that I have here, and you're a maker tier or above member on Patreon, please feel free to send a message and let me know exactly what size you need, and I will get those files posted. Now I'm sure I could come up with a much better solution, especially once I get this design more finalized, but at least for now, that's probably going to be the best way to go about it, especially while the design is still kind of a work in progress. Not exactly an ideal solution, I know, but I'll definitely be posting every single variation that I make on Patreon, so if by chance somebody else needed the exact wheelbase that you do, it'll be right there. Now, of course, if you have CAD software and the knowledge of how to edit these 3D files, that's always an option, but I don't want anyone to have to go through that trouble if they don't want to. I can't always do everything, but whenever possible, I'm always happy to make alterations to the designs we have available to allow them to better fit your project. Now, something I get asked fairly often is whether or not die-cast bodies can be used with these chassis. In general, I wouldn't recommend it, as those bodies are much heavier, which puts a lot more stress on these parts and is really going to overwork these smaller size electronics. Honestly, if you're not really interested in the process of building a plastic model kit, rather than trying to make a die-cast body work, I would instead consider looking at some ready-to-run options like, again, a Kyosho Mini Z, as they make a ton of different bodies that, although are plastic, they come pre-painted, fully assembled, and show some fantastic shelf-worthy detail, and they'll clip right onto that Mini Z chassis. I can definitely understand the idea of wanting to use a die-cast body, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but in the world of on-road RC, it's generally better to keep things light, and if you are going to go heavy, you better have some serious electronics and drivetrain parts to propel it forward. These DIY plastic chassis and tiny space-saving electronics may not be quite up to the task. At this point though, this new chassis design is complete, and here's a look at what I've got so far. Very simple, but at this point I was just really excited to get these parts 3D printed, put it together, and see how well everything works. So let's go ahead and move on to that stage of the project. With the design work now complete, it's now time to take these parts from digital to physical and get all of these components 3D printed. I'm using a 0.25 size nozzle and PLA filament to print all of these parts. For these larger pieces in particular, a bigger nozzle would certainly make things go a lot quicker, but particularly when printing some of these smaller components, I'd recommend using a smaller size nozzle for better resolution with these tiny parts, such as the FC01 front suspension assembly. As you can see, there's really not much to this chassis. Very simple, but hopefully it performs well. If you'd like to build one of these chassis along with me, the STL files are available on our Patreon. The link is below in the description. I'll do my best to walk you through the assembly process here in this video. We'll also have some diagrams and information on that Patreon post as well. As you can see here, I already had a set of FC01 control arms and knuckles put together and ready to go. I won't be covering the process of assembling the FC01 in this video, as I've already covered that in detail previously. You'll find all the information you need on our Patreon. Feel free to start there and get those FC01 assemblies put together, just as I have here, and then continue on with the rest of the chassis. I started out by securing these upper and lower pieces of the chassis with some M2 hardware and some 1.8mm inner diameter O-rings. Using some O-rings that aren't the exact same size as what I have here would work just as well. These are just some that I happen to have on hand. The exact length of the hardware that you'll need here will depend on your particular project. If I recall correctly, I started out with some 18mm length pieces of M2 hardware, but I cut them down lower to be more the height that I needed, so there isn't a bunch of excess threads showing above. Obviously, you'll want to make sure that you're leaving enough height in this section to fit all of the electronics that you'll be using. Smaller size electronics like these are great when you want to emphasize scale realism, as it will be far easier to include details like a full depth interior with these tiny components being used. But if you want your car to have a higher top speed, generally larger size components will be necessary for this increase in performance. It all just depends on what you want to prioritize with your project. By snugging down these fasteners with those nylon lock nuts, it's creating some tension and helping to make the chassis more rigid. There are some 2mm openings towards the back of the chassis that allow some small size springs to be installed for the rear suspension. Cut these springs to whatever length you think is best and provides a sufficient amount of support. This N20 motor and gear assembly will be held in with some M1.6x6 fasteners. A fully threaded M2 rod will be used to secure the rear wheels, along with some 2x5x2mm bearings. Some 4x2mm hex mounts and M2 nuts will be used to secure these particular wheels that I'm using, which are included with the STL files. I'd certainly recommend 3D printing these on a high detail resin printer if possible. If you'll be using different wheels from these, such as the wheels included in the plastic model kit, some custom work will likely be required to make them fit, as I've showcased with some prior projects. Some wheels are certainly easier to modify and make work with these chassis than others, but they tend to provide the best scale appearance when successfully installed. While using these RC-specific wheels will result in the M2 nuts and some excess axle shaft being visible, it's a very simple and practical setup, which does have the advantage of these wheels being easily removable if needed. I started out by doing some mock-ups to determine how long I needed the rear axle shaft to be. I don't want a ton of extra threads to be showing, so once I figured out exactly where I wanted the wheels to be positioned, I cut off any excess. Once that was complete, I went ahead and slid the rear axle through the bearings with the gear on one end and a nut on the opposite end, which I glued into position after ensuring the axle is centered. After that, I went ahead and pressed the motor gear onto the output shaft, and here's what I've got so far. Next, I secured the rear wheels in place, making sure that they're aligned correctly with the body, not sticking out beyond the wheel arches or tucked too far inside. With the rear of the chassis looking good, I went ahead and moved on to the front, starting with installing the steering servo. This here is one of the micro 2-gram servos that we sell, however other similar size micro servos should work as well. It is a tight squeeze, so you may need to do a little bit of sanding in this area, especially if you're using a different servo from what I'm using, but you should be able to get it to fit. I used two M1.6x5mm screws to secure the servo. I went ahead and modified the included servo arm and secured this piece included with the FC01 front suspension to it using some M1x3 self-tapping screws. Obviously, this chassis does consist of some pretty tiny parts and some even tinier hardware, so make sure you're comfortable working with components of this size if you're attempting to build one of these chassis. A good set of micro screwdrivers really helps. I went ahead and glued together a couple of ball joints using 1mm dowel pins and some 2mm jewelry beads that I glued into place on the servo arm. One end of the tie rods will connect here and the other end to the knuckles, as you can see here. There you can see the FCO1 control arms and steering knuckles that I had put together previously. To secure these assemblies to the rest of the chassis, choose whichever size front suspension mounts you think is best for your project and secure them to the rest of the chassis using M1.6 by 4mm screws. The servo arm simply gets installed using the fastener included with the servo, and then the control arms can be secured with M1 by 4mm screws. I carefully installed a couple of 3mm outer diameter springs for the front suspension. I'll do some more chassis tuning a little later on in this video, as I want to make sure there's enough support to handle the weight of the car without there being too much force to where the suspension doesn't want to move. The front suspension and steering is just about complete. One final thing I needed to do was finish the tie rods by cutting two pieces of 1.5mm steel rod to the correct length and gluing them to each end. The exact length that these rods will need to be will depend on which suspension mount that you choose. You also want to make sure that they aren't too long or too short, as this will affect the toe angle. Once the tie rods were complete, I went ahead and installed the front wheels, obviously making sure that they're secure, but also not over tightening them to where they can't spin freely. As you can see, the turning radius is looking pretty good. By no means up to the standards of a drift car, but there are plenty of purpose-built chassis in this size if that's what you're wanting to do. And that's about all there is to getting this chassis put together. Again, the design is still a work in progress, so some things may change with future iterations, but so far it's looking like a pretty good base for some custom builds. I went ahead and mocked it up with the body, as you can see here. It's looking good, but I did determine that I wanted to space out those front wheels just a little more to get them closer to the outer edge of the fenders. I didn't end up needing to remove any material around the front wheel arches, which is sometimes necessary to ensure there's no wheel rubbing while steering, but from time to time that may be necessary with some projects. This is just one of the reasons why, ideally, I like to get the body fitted and make any necessary adjustments before doing the painting, as it's a bit more stressful to have to sand down areas of the body after the paint has been applied. But once I was happy with how everything was lining up, I went ahead and removed any excess threads from the front axles, resulting in a much better finished look. At this point, the chassis is complete. If you decide to build one of these and have any questions, please feel free to send a message or let me know if you need this chassis adjusted to fit a specific wheelbase. I'll share more of my thoughts on what I think of this platform later on in the video. But of course, this car isn't going to move under its own power until I get those electronics installed, so let's go ahead and have a closer look at that process. Unlike some of the more detailed cars in the scale that I've showcased here on the channel, the electronics for this project are pretty simple and straightforward. Not much in the way of soldering or wiring, pretty much just plug and play. First, as I said previously, that's one of our 2-gram micro servos that I have up there on the front, with a 4,000 RPM N20 motor and gear assembly in the rear. These little N20 motors aren't going to be the fastest thing in the world of RC, however they're small, durable, and inexpensive, making them great for projects like this. I've used these motors for many projects in the past, and in my opinion, they provide plenty of pep for a super scale plastic model to RC conversion. The remaining electronics that I'll be using for this project include a 300 mAh 2S LiPo battery. It's small enough to be able to easily fit in this car, while the 300 mAh will provide a decent amount of runtime. This here is the same ESC that I've used previously for projects like that GMC General and Mac DM800. I'll have it linked over on our Patreon, but this is a 3S capable ESC, meaning I could increase the speed if I wanted to by plugging in a 3S LiPo battery. This is a 12-volt N20 motor, so it would handle that additional power just fine, and as a result, this car would be capable of higher top speeds, although the 2S LiPo fits a little better in this particular Corvette. 3S, though, is still an option with this ESC. Last but certainly not least, I'm using a R4 FGM receiver from Radiolink, as I have for many projects prior. These are fantastic little receivers that I'm pairing with my Radiolink RC6GS transmitter. The R4 FGM's relatively small size makes it ideal for projects like this, and there's actually a little gyro inside, which is a nice feature if you want to make the car more stable to drive, especially when cornering. They're also not too expensive, usually being around 10 to 15 bucks, just an all-around great receiver for projects like this. Everything was pretty much just plug and play. As is typical, the steering servo goes into channel 1 and the ESC into channel 2. The only thing I really did here was I cut the wires from the ESC that go to the motor shorter and then just soldered them directly onto the motor. This is just to save a bit of space and help keep everything tidy. Overall, very simple and straightforward, and as you can see, everything fits nicely onto the chassis, about as compact as I could hope for. I'm able to have all of these electronics positioned in the middle of the chassis, and I was hoping that those plugs going to the receiver there towards the front of the chassis wouldn't be too tall, and as it turns out, it was just barely able to fit without any modifications needed in that area of the car, which I was really happy about. Also, everything is low enough here, so I'll be able to add a shallow interior. It won't be anything that deep or detailed, but something is better here than nothing when it comes to adding an interior. At this stage, I wanted to go ahead and power everything up and do a quick test to make sure everything is working as it should. When you power on your car for the first time, you may need to reverse the position of the steering or throttle if it's not steering or moving in the correct direction when you move the wheel or move the throttle. Also, you'll want to go ahead and set your steering endpoints or reduce the steering dual rate to ensure you're not overworking the servo, trying to push the steering beyond its physical limits. This is usually a very simple and straightforward process on any hobby-grade radio, but like with anything, if you're not sure, refer to the manual for your specific transmitter. That information will be in there. As you can see here, everything is working just as it should, and at this stage, the chassis is complete. Now time to move on to the fun part of this project, which is building up that Corvette to go on top. No point in building an RC chassis without a nice body to put on top, so let's go ahead and start making this thing look a bit more presentable. I've once again reached into the stash and decided now is as good a time as any to go ahead and build this C6 Corvette that I've had sitting in my collection for years now. The 1/25th scale 2005 Corvette from Revell. Although well before my time, I love building some of the older cars and trucks from the 1980s and earlier, but that said, much like with that Audi R8, this has been a fun project building one of the cars that I remember from when I was a kid. 2005 was the first year of the all-new 6th generation or C6 Corvette, building upon the success established with the previous C5 generation. The C6 would feature various improvements, including the all-new 6-liter LS2 V8, producing around 400 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds of torque, enabling 0 to 60 times of a bit over 4 seconds, and a top speed of over 180 miles per hour. Quite impressive numbers for 2005, particularly when considering its comparatively much lower price to other sports cars with similar performance on the market. With the new generation came new styling, available as both a convertible and coupe with a removable targa top. Distinctive styling elements such as the 4-round taillights would remain, while new elements such as the exposed headlights, not seen on a Corvette since the 1962 model year, would be added. While pop-up headlights are often fondly remembered today as another example of old-school automotive design that's no longer present in today's vehicles, I remember even as a young kid thinking that the switch to these exposed headlights seen on the C6 was an improvement in design, making the Corvette seem a lot more with the times. The prior 2004 C5 Corvette is generally considered to be the final mass-produced car to feature pop-up headlights, and as much as I like the design of the C5, I remember at the time thinking that the pop-up headlights made the design look kind of dated when compared to other hot cars from Ferrari, Maserati, Porsche, Lamborghini, and Mercedes. The styling may be objective, but the improved aerodynamics and lack of mechanical parts to break is an undeniable improvement. Speaking of improvement, in the years following its introduction in 2005, various high-performance and special variants of the C6 would be introduced, such as the Z06, ZR1, and Grand Sport. This generation would help build the foundation for future iterations of the Corvette, with the final C6 rolling off the assembly line in 2013. Model builders interested in building this generation Corvette have plenty of options to choose from. This particular model kit that I have here is a 2011 reissue from Revell, who has also produced other variations such as a convertible in the form of a snap kit, Z06 and ZR1 models, as well as Le Mans race cars. AMT has also produced a number of C6 Corvettes in 1/25th scale, which look pretty good, but I'm not very familiar with these kits, nor do I have any experience building them. I'm pretty sure at least some, if not all of these kits are generally what's referred to as a curbside kit, which means that they lack an openable hood and detailed engine bay. Obviously, that lack of detail might be a deal breaker for some hobbyists, however, particularly if you're using this kit for an RC conversion, it may not be that big of a deal. But if you're looking for a 1/25th scale model of a C6 Corvette, it certainly seems like you have some good options, with this particular model being no exception. As far as availability is concerned, depending on which kit you are most interested in, you may have to do some hunting, particularly if you want to find one for a more reasonable price. Being that most of these kits were manufactured in the 2000s or early 2010s with no reissues in more recent years, it's not as though they're old enough to where they really seem to be all that rare, but that said, some of them can be a little pricey, at least from the few that I've seen on places like eBay. If you're fortunate enough to live near an area that does model car shows and swap meets, I'd imagine you could probably do quite a bit better on price, as again, it's not like these kits are really that rare or vintage, but I guess old enough to where it's been quite a while since they were sitting on store shelves. A little patience would probably go a long way if you're trying to score a deal, particularly with the kits like the ZR1 or Z06 specifically. But let's go ahead and crack this particular kit open and have a look at all of the parts that are inside. Just like with that Audi R8 that I built, I have opened up this kit previously and did a little bit of work on it, including priming the body. Unlike that Audi R8 previously though, where I thought I had all the pieces in that kit, here with this Corvette I actually did have all of the pieces right there in the box, so no time wasted hunting down parts. I am glad I opened up this box previously though, because from the factory it was missing the targa top and side view mirrors. I think this may have been the only time I've ever had missing parts in a model kit. I sent an email to Revell and they gladly mailed me those missing parts very quickly too. This was years ago, but hopefully their customer service is just as good now as it was then. Very cool and really helped cement my favorable view of Revell, on top of them offering a lot of really nice kits. Obviously at this point I could say with hindsight that this is a very nicely designed kit that went together very well. Of course, some trimming and sanding was necessary in some spots, as is going to be typical with really any model kit. But as long as you're willing to do that necessary prep work to ensure proper fitment, and do some test fits prior to painting and gluing, I think you're going to find everything goes together very well and builds into a fantastic looking model. Obviously some modern tooling here, as the car only dates back to the mid-2000s, all around nicely molded parts with a lot of detail. Now, not really a ton of individual parts in this kit, which is perfectly fine with me. I know some hobbyists really prefer having a lot of individual parts and pieces, but really sometimes I find it more practical to not have to deal with as many individual components, but I can kind of see both sides. The assembly process is far more authentic when you're putting everything together piece by piece, just as it would be on the real car. One kind of unique thing that I thought was a nice inclusion is that they give you some metal pieces to use for the ends of the tailpipes, a really nice bit of added detail. Initially, I was considering using the wheels and tires that were included in this kit, just as I did previously with that Audi R8. However, unlike the R8, these wheels here didn't seem to be quite as ideal of a design to adapt for use with my custom RC chassis. Anything is possible, but I decided to just reach into the parts bin and grab a set of RC wheels that I thought would look good paired with this body. Definitely holding on to those tires though, as I'm sure those will come in handy for a future project. Of course, many of the parts that you see here will go unused for this RC build, while others will require some extensive hacking to make fit, but more on that a little later. The body, which is really the most important part here, looks great. Well molded, nicely detailed, and looks extremely accurate when compared to the real car. A variety of decals are included to help add further detail. These include exterior emblems as well as interior and engine bay details. The instructions are pretty basic but quite useful for putting this kit together. I think they may have forgotten to include the steps for placing some of the decals, but just using some reference images online will help you to know where all of these little under the hood decals are supposed to go. I had already done some prep work and laid down a coat of primer previously, so it didn't take much for this body to be ready for paint. Again, just a really nice kit that I think will especially appeal to all the Corvette fans as well as model builders in general. If you really want your kit to have a higher part count and a lot of individual components, this might not be one that you'll enjoy as much. However, if that's not an issue or you actually prefer not having to deal with all of those tiny pieces, this is definitely a great option, especially if you could snag one up for a good price. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Also, I think this would be a pretty good kit for a beginner. This is a skill level 2, so a step up from the more basic snap kits, and it is going to require some paint and glue. But again, you don't have a ton of different tiny parts and pieces to deal with, and everything in this kit pretty much just falls right into place as long as you're willing to do the necessary prep work. That includes things like using a sharp blade to cut off any remnants of the sprue, doing a bit of sanding to ensure proper fitment, basic stuff like that. It takes some extra time, but it will deliver a much better looking model in the end and will make the assembly process much easier. But at this point, I've had a great look at this kit and everything that's included, so it's time to do any necessary modifications to allow it to fit this RC chassis. It's time to get hacking and make this piece fit over top of the chassis. As you can see, the interior and inner fenders are all a single piece, which I actually think worked out pretty well for this project, rather than having a bunch of individual parts that first needed to be glued together. Obviously though, some serious modifications are going to be required to allow enough space underneath. I first went ahead and located all of the interior parts, as well as this inner fender piece for the right side that I wanted to make sure I'd have glued into place before I did any cutting. Yet another cool detail of this kit is that they include two different right side under hood pieces, both with and without the battery, as on some models of the C6 Corvette, the battery would be located in a compartment behind the passenger seat rather than under the hood. Good attention to detail here, which makes sense since, as I talked about earlier, Revell has released other variations of this kit, such as the Z06 and ZR1. It's cool to see the differences being accurately represented. I got all of the interior pieces located and ready to be put together. I started out by installing a few parts such as the door panels prior to doing any cutting. I'm going to need to essentially raise up the floor on this interior and make it much shallower so it'll fit over top of the chassis. An obvious compromise on scale realism, however even a shallow interior can still look pretty good on a finished vehicle. It's not always immediately apparent that these modifications have been made, especially when photographed or looked at from the right angle. Pretty much any interior is better than no interior in my opinion, though there is certainly some extra work required to make everything fit. And as I'm sure you could tell, I like to be very precise with all of these cuts. Yeah, not really. In the beginning, I'm just hacking off the bottom, making some rough cuts with a hot knife which goes through that plastic just like butter, and then obviously a rotary tool with a cutting disc works great as well. And then I'm making sure I'm doing some mock-ups and kind of envisioning how everything is going to fit around the chassis below, not only with the interior, but also especially around those front wheels. Those inner fender sections look really nice, but unfortunately they're kind of interfering with the front wheels when they're steering, so I really had to hack away at those. And it's just a really gradual process of removing more and more material, checking fitment, removing a bit more, and hopefully I have something left when it's all over. Eventually, that interior piece was starting to look like this, certainly a lot shorter than what I started with. As I get near the end, I do start to get a little bit more careful with how much material I'm removing, and I also switched using some side cutters and sanding blocks to help clean up the edge rather than just hacking away at it with a rotary tool. It's not as though I'm really concerned about making the underside of this piece look perfect, as it's not going to be visible on the finished car. But I definitely want to make sure that I have at least a somewhat level surface to glue a scrap piece of plastic into place to form the new floor and make things look as tidy as possible from the top side. It's kind of hard to tell here since I'm using some clear plastic, but I did go ahead and cut a piece just large enough to create the new floor and then glued that to the bottom. Once painted, not only will this floor hide the RC chassis below, but it will also provide a nice flat surface to install some rare earth magnets, which will hold the body in place. You've seen this process many times before if you've been following this channel, but no point in messing with a good method like this. It's as simple as one set of magnets gets secured to the chassis and the other to the underside of the body, or technically the underside of the interior piece in this case. And just like that, you've got a body that can be securely mounted while also easily removable when needed. Of course, when you're gluing the body into place, make sure that you're lining it up correctly with the chassis, with all the wheels being positioned in the center of each wheel well. Just pay attention to the alignment before letting that glue dry. I like to use a thicker adhesive such as shoe goo, which is what I'm using for this car. It creates a nice strong bond but also doesn't harden right away, allowing some time to ensure the body is positioned correctly. Also, because it's much thicker than something like super glue, it can bridge the gap between the bottom of the interior and the top of the magnet, since that surface might not be perfectly flat, and therefore the magnet can't sit snugly against that surface without affecting the position of the body. With the thick adhesive, I don't have to worry about the bottom of that interior being perfectly flat and level. Just get that body positioned exactly where I want it and let it sit overnight, and that glue will fill any space that may be present between the magnets and the underside of that interior. Use tape to hold everything where you want it as necessary while that glue hardens. If you'd rather use something like a 2-part epoxy, that works great as well. I also like to place a little piece of paper between the upper and lower magnets while gluing, just to ensure that I don't accidentally glue the two magnets together. Everything's looking good there, so I'm going to go ahead and set that aside to dry, and in the meantime, I'm going to work on a few other things, such as chopping down these seats. Obviously, with the bottom of the interior now much higher up, I need to adjust the seats accordingly so they won't be too tall. Next on the chopping block are these parts that go in the rear. I obviously won't need this whole chassis piece nor the entire exhaust. However, I do need the very end, which will be glued to the underside of the body. Once again, it's just a matter of cutting off what I need and leaving what I don't. By doing some test fits, I did determine that I was going to need to remove some material in a few spots to make sure this piece doesn't come into contact with the gear driving the rear axle, but with a little bit of hacking, it's looking like everything is going to fit perfectly. With that N20 motor sitting where it is, there's only enough room to fit the very end of the exhaust. What I did was cut away everything except the backside of the mufflers, and I added a small piece of styrene to the backside of this lower panel. That way I'll have a nice place to glue the top side of each muffler. Very simple, and once everything that you see here has been painted and glued together, it's going to look great on the rear of this Corvette. Moving from the back to the front, I wanted to figure out a way that I could add some additional detail to the engine bay. I located some of those LS2 engine components along with the air intake, and I was hoping that I could modify it all to fit around the steering servo. There isn't really a ton of space to work with in this area, as I could only position the steering servo so low, so I think what I was able to come up with here turned out looking pretty good, all things considered. I needed to modify some of these parts to fit around the steering servo. Some of them will be glued onto the body, while the top of the engine will be glued to the servo, still allowing the body to be easily removable without worrying about damaging any of these small pieces under the hood. Now, it certainly won't be the most lifelike or detailed engine bay ever built, but it's at least something to look at. I'll do a bit more work in this area later on, but by this time the glue for the magnets had dried. You might notice that slightly poor placement of the tape relative to that magnet there, but fortunately I was able to get it off, but that's just something to think about and try not to overlook. At this stage, I continue to do a little more refinement on the very front around the wheels, making sure that they have enough room to steer. I ended up hacking off these upper portions around the wheels entirely since they won't really be visible on the finished car, just trying to get every millimeter of clearance that I can. I also ended up installing some longer springs on the front suspension to apply a bit more pressure and help support the front of the car with the added weight of the body and interior. Throughout the process of doing these modifications, I did some test drives to ensure everything is functioning as it should and making sure that there isn't any wheel rubbing, or at least not too much wheel rubbing. It's a pretty tight squeeze getting everything to function without the occasional contact while still keeping some form of an engine bay in place. By this point, I was discovering a few minor flaws in this chassis design, which we'll talk about more during the test drive portion of this video. I attempted to mitigate some vibration and provide a tiny bit of extra support in the rear with a little piece of a spring that goes between the bottom of the interior and this motor mount. In a perfect world, I wish there was a little bit more of a gap between the bottom of the interior and this motor mount, as there's really not a whole lot of room for the rear suspension to flex, but it is what it is. I don't want to cut away at this rear section of the interior, nor do I want to change the ride height. There's often a little bit of a delicate balance of lifelike aesthetics and functionality when it comes to building these custom RC models. Here's all that was left of the interior piece at this point. I pretty much removed and sanded down everything that I could, just short of removing these inner fender sections entirely. With there not really being anything left to do with this piece, I moved on to assembling and test fitting some of the other components, like the openable hood. Like I say with all of these builds, it's really important to go ahead and test fit everything at this stage of the project and make any adjustments as necessary. It's much better to do that now before the paint has been applied. Fortunately, the fit and finish on this kit is very good, with very little work needing to be done to ensure every part goes into place just like it's supposed to. Maybe a little sanding here and a little trimming there, which can be a bit tedious on some of these smaller parts, but you'll get a much better looking result in the end by taking the time to ensure everything fits as precisely as possible. Just like how I used some magnets to hold the body in place, I'll once again use some rare earth magnets to hold the hood closed. These ones here are even tinier. This hood is kind of a loose fit and I don't want it to be rattling around while driving, so I just placed one set of magnets in a fairly convenient location, and that's all it takes to keep it securely closed, though still easily openable. Although on the real car, this roof panel would be removable, I decided to go ahead and just glue it into place on the body. Since the interior here is going to be very shallow and not have a ton of detail, I don't intend to display this car with the roof removed. So instead of coming up with some way to secure this piece in place while driving, yet still allowing it to be removable, I decided the best and easiest option would be to just glue it into place. At this point, all of the modifications to allow this model kit to fit the chassis were complete. The final thing I did was one last pass with some sandpaper to remove any imperfections that might still remain on the body. Once that was done, it's now time to start painting. All of the modifications necessary to allow the C6 Corvette to sit on top of this custom RC chassis were complete. After giving everything a thorough wash and securing all the parts using some tape to help make painting easier, it was time to start spraying. Pretty much everything was painted using hardware store spray cans except for the body, which I used automotive touch-up paint. I'm going with a matte black interior to help it not stand out too much, as it is quite shallow and I don't want to draw too much attention to it. I want you to know it's there but not look too closely. I'll also be going with black for the exterior color. I'm by no means an expert painter, but it always seems like something ends up biting me, and while the body in most areas looks pretty good, as you could see here, for some reason there's a ton of texture on the surface of both the hood and the roof, but nowhere else on the body. It may be a little bit hard to tell on camera, but there's just an ugly texture that's only present on these two individual parts. Nowhere else on the rest of the body is there anything like this. I did what I could to remedy this undesirable effect by doing some sanding with some 1500 grit paper and then applying some additional coats of paint, but it seemed like no matter what I did, I just couldn't get this texture to go away. It's really not even much of a texture, as it feels smooth but looks very rough. This is a new one for me, as I've never had this happen with any prior build. All of these parts were washed and dried before applying the paint, and the same primer was used on all parts of the body, so I'm not really sure why these two parts in particular are producing this undesirable effect. I'm no expert painter here, but I'm really not sure what I could have done to prevent this. If the paint I was using or the way I was applying it was the issue, wouldn't it show up in other places on the body and not specifically on these two pieces and nowhere else, even just a few millimeters away? Oh well, it is what it is. That aside, it's not looking too bad, and after that paint had dried, I began adding some additional details by hand and applying the water slide decals. There really aren't a lot of details that needed to be added to this body, just the marker lights, emblems, and license plates, and that's about it, at least for now. After that, the clear coat was applied to give the car a nice glossy finish and help protect these added details. I was kind of hoping that a nice thick clear coat could help hide that undesirable paint texture on the hood and the roof, but it didn't really make that much of a difference. Moving back over to all of these other parts that I painted, I could begin to add some additional detail to them and get everything glued together. In addition to those exterior emblems and license plate options, a number of decals to add some detail to the interior and engine bay are also included, which is always nice to see. I'm not going over the top here, but a little bit of time spent with a brush really helps to start adding to the lifelike look of this car and helps to make some of these details pop. There are some things that I don't want to pop out though. A white chassis is not exactly ideal for making it less visible, so I went ahead and painted a few sections of it that will be visible under the hood black to help blend it in. Here's a look at the completed dash. Pretty simple, but once installed in the car, it's going to really blend in and help to add to the overall appearance. I went ahead and got that glued to the rest of the interior along with the seats. After that, it was time to install the decals on all of the under the hood components. Like I talked about earlier during that unboxing, I'm not sure if all of the decal placements were specified in the manual, but a quick Google image search and maybe even a magnifying glass for some of those tiny decals that go on the caps for the washer fluid reservoir and the master cylinder are really helpful to ensure that you get all of them placed where they're supposed to go. An overall very simple engine bay that I've got here, but I think it's going to look great with the finished car. Up next were the wheels, which I had painted silver. They looked okay in that black resin, but a coat of paint certainly helps to make them pop. I went ahead and stretched over a set of silicone tires and glued the brake rotors into place. It may be kind of hard to tell, but these wheels are staggered with a couple of slightly wider wheels going in the rear, so I made sure to keep track of both sizes when getting them mounted to the chassis. Up next was this rear panel that I had modified earlier. I glued the exhaust and reverse lights into place. I can't wait to see how this looks glued to the body. The windows and lights were next. You could install these parts as is, however, one of the things that I like to do to add a bit more detail is go around the outer edge of the headlights with a black marker or paint pen. Just an easy way to add some more detail. Also note that on the center brake light on the real cars, everything would be black except for this part here in the center, so if you want to duplicate that look, you'll need to apply some paint. Now, just like I talked about with that Audi R8 build, for the best results when it comes to painting the black borders on the windshield and rear glass, masking and airbrushing tends to deliver the best result. However, I was a little lazy here and just decided to freehand these sections. The painting here wasn't going so well, not at all a very clean line down here on the bottom, so I switched to using a Sharpie and although it takes a bit longer as multiple coats are required, the finished result looks pretty good. Unless you're really observing it closely, it basically might as well be airbrushed. I applied some black paint to the back of the otherwise fully chromed rearview mirror, and then I also added a little bit of detail to the headlights to try and better match the look of the real thing. It's very simple to do, just using a Sharpie to color in the middle of these parts here, so why not? By this time, the clear coat on the body was dry. I was sort of hoping that maybe it would kind of cover up that undesirable texture on the hood and roof, but it's still pretty noticeable. I did a little bit of polishing, but I didn't spend that much time with it, as it was pretty clear that this paint job isn't going to be perfect, so I just decided to say good enough and move on to getting the car finished. It's not like the rest of the paint is anything amazing, though if it wasn't for that hood and roof, everything else looks decent enough, but I went ahead and continued on by adding some flat black details to a few sections on the body. Just looking at some real-world photos and trying to match any spots that wouldn't be body color on the real thing. Subtle details like these are easy to add and really helps bring the car to life. At this stage, it was time to start gluing everything together. The important thing here is to make sure you're using the right kind of glue for the right parts. For example, make sure you're using a glue that dries clear for all of the clear parts, including the windows and lights. While super glue, as an example, is great for holding certain parts as it's quite strong and dries very quickly, it can leave a white haze, which is not at all ideal for transparent parts. So it's best to use something like Mod Podge, which dries clear and won't produce any haze. This car is really coming to life now, although as you'll see in just a bit, I installed this rear panel a bit too early as I wasn't able to get the interior installed with it in place. Not a big deal though. I did continue on by painting this lower air dam matte black, something that I meant to do earlier on but forgot. Again, very subtle, but these little details really do make the difference. Alright, a pretty exciting step now. It's time to finally combine the interior and the body. I spread some shoe goo along the edges of the interior and then slid it right into place. And again, as I just said, I got a little ahead of myself there putting that lower panel on, but no damage fortunately. I just glued it back into place later on. Now we can really start to admire this Corvette. The body appears to be aligned pretty much perfectly, ride height looks good, just a few final items to add at this point. Among those final items being the side view mirrors. I tend to like to save those as some of the final pieces that I add, so I don't have to worry about breaking them off during the assembly process. These side view mirrors here in this kit though fit very snugly into place and are easy to get lined up. I'll get this appropriately scaled Make It RC decal put here on the back window, and with that in place, I'm going to call this car complete. Paint issues aside, I'm really happy with how this car turned out, and it was certainly a very fun vehicle to build. I think both the paint color and wheel choice fit this car very well, and that interior and engine bay, even if a bit shallow, really elevates this build to another level. A very simple model kit to put together, and after admittedly quite a bit of hacking, everything fits onto this chassis very well. I couldn't resist pulling out some of our props and getting some nice scale shots of this Corvette ready to tear up those 1/25th scale streets. I don't really have a great racetrack setup at the moment, however just cruising around has been a lot of fun, and I think this platform certainly has some potential, though also could definitely use a bit of refinement in some areas. Having a functional suspension is great to see and is certainly a step up from the FPUC1. It's kind of hard to make out on camera, but the front end does lift up under hard acceleration, which is pretty cool to watch and certainly adds a bit of realism. Unfortunately though, there is quite a bit of vibration in the rear, as you can see. This very simple and very crude suspension setup seems like it would benefit from a little more refinement. Maybe utilizing those same tie rod ends that you see on the front could be used in the rear to act as control arms, which could help keep things a little less shaky. It is probably fair to point out that I did some cutting in this area to help soften the suspension early on, as I wanted a bit more movement. In hindsight though, this may not have been the wisest decision, as things are now a little too floppy. For those who would like to eliminate the possibility of vibrations like this, I do have a no-flex version posted that has a more solid connection here that is not meant to act like a suspension, instead be more rigid just like the FPUC1. Clearly, I think this chassis will benefit from a little more refinement in this area, but it's not like I need an excuse to do some more tinkering and build another RC car. The front end, being the tried and true FC01, works perfectly, and despite the locked rear axle, the turning radius is pretty good. Though unfortunately with this particular Corvette, there is a bit of wheel rub, as you can probably tell by that hopping motion on the front end when turning. Well, at least the engine bay that's responsible for this looks pretty good, and check out that free hood prop that I found just laying around. And just as I said earlier, that N20 motor isn't exactly going to make this thing a rocket ship, but in my opinion, it's got plenty of pep for projects like these, certainly fast enough to do some damage to a great looking body that you've spent hours building if you're not careful. This seems to be due to the ESC that I chose for this project, but I do notice that the low speed control isn't all that great. Not necessarily an issue or anything, but I could definitely see if you wanted to build a car like this that you intended to run at slower speeds, you might want to consider a lower RPM motor or a different ESC entirely. Issues aside though, I'm definitely looking forward to tinkering more with this platform and using it as a base for another plastic model to RC conversion. Just an all-around very fun and relatively simple build top to bottom, with a paint job that I'm not going to be too afraid to get a few scratches. Catch the light at just the right angle though, and it looks pretty good. An all-around great-looking replica of a C6 Corvette that's made a fine addition to my growing micro RC collection. I wonder what car I should build next. So there you go, another build in the books. What a fun project, and thank you all so much for watching this little Corvette come to life. An all new but promising 3D printable chassis design and a great looking model kit to put on top, an absolutely winning formula. I enjoy the process of designing these custom chassis and working out all the bugs just as much as I enjoy building up these model kits and trying to make everything look as lifelike as possible. You sort of have that balance of engineering and artistry with these projects, and that's what I think really makes them a lot of fun. Like I've mentioned, I'm going to continue to tinker with this platform and see what kind of improvements I can make, but if you'd like to give building one of these chassis a try and also help support the channel in the process, you'll find the STL files posted on our Patreon, link is below in the description. Of course, you also have access to our other chassis designs, such as the FPUC1, FFR-SC1, and CTC01. All with their own unique set of strengths and are designed for certain types of plastic model to RC conversions. As always, your feedback and ideas are appreciated, and it'll be fun to see what we can build utilizing this platform and how good we can make it while still remaining within the confines of a simple, inexpensive, and easy to 3D print chassis. For all the Corvette fans out there, certainly keep an eye out for one of these C6 kits from Revell. I'm very happy with how this car went together, though if you're wanting something with a little heavier emphasis on performance and don't mind compromising a bit when it comes to looks, I consider removing that detailed engine bay entirely, and that way you won't have to worry about any wheel rubbing up front. Maybe also cut out or raise up the floor in the back of the interior to give that rear suspension, as primitive as it may be, a little more room to move. But again, overall very happy with how this car turned out, and also looking forward to the next project utilizing this chassis and seeing what kind of improvements can be made. Once again, I really appreciate everyone's patience with these videos. No shortage of cool stuff in the works, that's for sure. Just takes quite a bit of time to get everything edited. Just trying to strike a nice balance of putting together a quality video while also trying to get as many videos out as possible. Again, and as always, a huge thanks to all of the support from our patrons and channel members, as well as each and every one of you for watching. If you enjoy these types of videos, a like certainly helps, and be sure to stay tuned for what we've got coming next. That's going to be all for today's video though. Thanks again everyone, and I will see you next time.